Hello and welcome. This is a video on how to create and populate graphs using GraphMaker in Unity. At the end of this tutorial, we'll create a graph like this one, but with different data. This graph is the line graph, which is a prefab in the GraphMaker folder here. To start off, we'll create an example scene, an example folder. Now that we got our scene, we're just going to delete the other graphs. Center this one. And next we're going to create a prefab, but for this prefab it will be an empty graph so that we can start from scratch without any data. To do that, we need to delete these two series here. The series objects are found as references here. So we can delete both of these, as well as clear this series list here. Now when we play, there will be an empty graph. Let's make this our prefab. Next, we'll create a script and spawn this prefab. Don't need the update function, but we will need the start. Here's our empty graph prefab. Let's just put this script on our canvas and drag and drop our empty graph. Next, we'll instantiate it, as well as create a reference to this graph. We'll also set its transform parent to the canvas without preserving world space. And we'll set our graph reference like so. Let's see if that works. Indeed, it is spawned. Alright, so we want to create some custom data. For this example, we'll just use a list. First, we need to use generic collections namespace for lists. And each series expects a list of vector 2's. So we'll call this series 1 data. And we can just put some values in through the inspector for now. Next, we need to add a series. There's a public function for this on the graph. Now we'll also want to get a reference to this series, so that we can set its data and also customize its look. And add series should return a reference to the series. Now if we play, we probably won't see anything except an empty white line there. And that is because we'll need to add the data here in the point values. So to add the data, point values, we use setList. All publicly exposed lists in GraphMaker are custom observable lists, so this is why we use the setList. So we can see the data here, but the scale does not look very good. And that is because the x-axis max is 100. So we'll want to change that to something like 3. Using the x-axis max value. Now, there are really two main forms that GraphMaker can plot data. The first is more like a scatter plot, where the x data matters. And that is with the use x dist between to space. So when these are enabled, it means the x data does not really matter. So we could put zeros. And when it is disabled, it means its position matters. So 3 is going to be, or 2.5 is going to be in the center for a 0 to 5. And let's just change the labels on the x-axis to make this more clear. To do that, we change the label type to, the set labels using maxmin. And we can also set the labels to be on the ticks instead of between the ticks. So this is a very brief introduction on how to create a scatter plot. Next, we will create something a bit more complicated, where we don't really care about the x data, but we want it to be a string. For example, like a category list of, apples and oranges, and those map to various values. So you can just put this in the inspector. So we'll do a little bit of string parsing. Assume that you get this data from like a database, for example, and each of these corresponds to a row. And let's say your categories are apples, and your column 2 is the data itself, and column 1 is the name. What's another fruit? Grapes. use some grapes. Okay, so we're just gonna split out the comma and then put this into Graph Maker. And we'll just do a Boolean here to say that we want to use this instead of the other one. So we split out strings, but we need to loop over each row. And then we'll get both columns. Or this is just row. Split on the comma. I think that works. Let me just debug it. So this, oh. Okay, I think these need to be single quotes. Yes. So apples, oranges, grapes, okay. So we want apples, oranges, grapes to display on the x-axis, and we want 258 to be the y dimension. So to do this, we're going to use a functionality in GraphMaker called groups. So we need to set groups to a list of strings that we essentially, that act as categories and that can also display as axis labels. So we need to create a list of strings for that. And populate our list of strings with column 1 of our rows, and then again set list. So this should populate our graph with apples, oranges, grapes in the groups list, and it does here. Next, we want to enable grouping, or use these groups. Next, we want the x-axis labels to display these. So we set the label type to groups. Lastly, we want to display this data, so we create a list of vector 2's, but we will only care about one dimension in this list of vector 2's. So we can put anything for x. I'm sorry, we can't put anything for x. We have to match x to the category we care about. In this case, x is actually the index of the groups list. The index plus 1, because null values are represented by negative numbers. If we didn't have data for a row, we would do negative. But since we have data for all rows, we set it to the index plus 1 of our list of groups. So the first will be 1, and then 2, and then 3. Then we set the y value to our second column, and we need to do some conversion here. I believe float dot try parse. We need to create a float here. Okay, we have our float. So we are adding new vector 2. For each row, we're adding I plus 1. This corresponds to its group. And then its y value to graph it on the y-axis. So let's see what we get. Nothing. Okay. Let's see what the series says. -1, -2, -3. That does not sound right. Let me debug these. Oh, I never set the data. So last step is to series 1 point values dot set list to the data. I think it's there, but it's not on the x-axis correctly because we need to enable the use x dist between. Okay, I think this should be it. So that is how to do something a bit more complex, where we're basically taking a list of rows from a database, for example, and turning them into categories as well as plotting them. So that is using the groups feature. Now, if you had a null or no data, you would expect the second column to be, for example, an empty string, as well as, yes, as an empty string, and you would detect that and put a negative here. So, for example, let's add one more row so we can better see it. What is another fruit? Plums. And let's make grapes null. So in this case, instead of float y parse, we can just say if row 1 or string dot is null or empty of row 1. So if it's that, then we want to do this. Otherwise, this. And we make this negative. And we can put any value here. And this will behave the same as before. So now we should see a broken line segment where it goes apples, oranges, line break, and then plums. Oops. We don't want negative for both. Copy paste error. And there we go. Apples, oranges, grapes, plums, and probably want to change the number of ticks on the x-axis to match our number of categories, which is here. There we go. So for that, we would do graph.x-axis.numTicks equals groups.count. And so now we have broken line segment. And we want to give our series a name as well. So it shows up in tooltips. Series name. Fruits data. Fruit data 25. And you would want to customize this tooltip. That would be in a script here, WMG graph tooltip, I believe. Yes. So to customize the tooltip, you just edit this script. But that covers graphing nulls as well as groups. Another thing to note is you don't actually need to do this here. GraphMaker will automatically detect rows or lack of data and add it. So this should be the same. Yes. And the reason is because we added all 4 groups using groups.add, but we didn't add data for one of them. And GraphMaker detected that and automatically put in the negative value for that. So just to prove it to you, if we put 5 here, we'd see negative 3, 5. Or perhaps not. I think GraphMaker will put 0 anyways. But yes, you don't actually need to do this step. So simpler would just be if not, and then populate the data. So that about covers this tutorial. Probably already running over time, but I hope that gives you a basic idea for how to plot both scatter plots, where our data contains both just an x and y float value, for example, as well as categorical based data, where our data contains a string matched to some float value. And those are the two most common ways to, or two of the most common ways data comes. So I hope that helps, and if not, I shall add more tutorials for populating more graphs. Thank you.